Greetings and welcome to Zord's Asteroid Space Program episode 4, where we are waiting for our next target, which happens to be a C-class asteroid named ZGW390, and it is just about to enter Kerbin's Sphere of Influence. Now we are going to prepare the actual redirect mission by launching up a fuel tanker, which is going to act as more or less a fuel depot because it's big and quite stationary, even though not stationary enough to be not very useful. But this is a rip-off of my previous tanker design, just scaled up one level. So the previous orange large fuel tanks, which were the center stack, are now replaced by the humongous new fuel tanks, and the small radial fuel tanks are replaced by orange fuel tanks, as we could see here. Now this vehicle launches a lot of fuel, way more than I need, so I'm just gonna put it in this orbit and leave it. Yeah, it looks really nice when it's flying over the poles there. So we have a stable orbit. I'm gonna tweak it a bit to make it so that it is exactly what I need, and we wait 3 hours, half Kerbin day, and then we'll launch the actual mission. And it's manned by Bill and Jeb, of course, and we are gonna launch into the same polar orbit, but whereas the fuel tanker went north, this one is going to go south. Important difference to keep in mind. Also, the actual payload is being launched upside down, and we're gonna see right now how this impacts the launch trajectory. Once the launch vehicle is done, we have to flip the entire thing around and keep going. Now this is obviously an evolution of my previous attempt, and something that has been built with the knowledge I have gained in mind. We have huge engines rather than nuclear ones. We have a long section of structural compartment, so that we have sufficient clearing for the engines to be able to fire, and also lots of fuel. Now we both have them in roughly the same orbit. Now we want them to come close enough together to be able to transfer the fuel. And it's simplest to fly the tanker, because well, first of all, it's ahead, so we just raise its apoapsis and make its period a little longer. This should sync them up, and it's just a lot easier to fly despite weighing hundreds of tons. Well, the asteroid catcher also weighs hundreds of tons, but the asteroid catcher has its engines and therefore its center of thrust ahead of its center of mass, which means it's inherently unstable, especially with the SAS system not compensating for gimbaling engines being on the wrong side of the center of mass. I have turned off the gimbals, locked them in center position, so we have no gimbals, but it's still unstable. Fortunately, with the RCS, it can be flown stable. Now, this craft has no docking ports, but it doesn't really matter because we have the claw. So as long as I can get this into position to grab onto something, we should be able to transfer the fuel. This is also a good time to practice the maneuvers I'm going to use to grab onto the asteroid in later. So we're flying this craft backwards because the claw is on the bottom. Fortunately, you can control from here, from the claw, so it makes it quite easy. Then I also have the SAS wheel out on the end, which makes the craft rather maneuverable. Now we have filled up the fuel, we're full of fuel, we have got some more RCS even, and let's plan the encounter with the asteroid. I hope we're going the right way, and let's see, maneuver node, we're going to go out, and yeah, it's quite a lot of fiddling around, but eventually we get it, and one orbit later, we're on our way. So we're doing this burn under the South Pole, which gives a very nice effect on the nav ball. And this orbit we're going to intersect is about as far out as Minmus. Well, it's no, not quite as far out as Minmus, so it's actually quite close. But of course, the asteroid itself is on a hyperbolic trajectory, so there's going to be quite a lot of relative velocity. And we're going to have to match speeds and then get back. So in terms of delta V, this mission is, well, not quite interplanetary, but almost. Well, it is interplanetary, but we're going back before we exit the sphere of influence. So we're getting close. Our orbital velocity is really low, like 100 meters per second, and the asteroid is something like 800 meters per second. So we're gonna have to do a sizable burn to match the velocities. Starting here, we have so much thrust from these two huge engines that yeah, I can afford to wait a bit longer and then have a better encounter. Now the reason I'm using these huge engines could seem a bit dumb. We don't need them. We're barely going to need them for when the asteroid's hooked up too. But actually, compared to the mainsail, which is another candidate, this engine has better specific impulse. Well, that's the most important part. It also has a way better thrust-weight ratio, weighing only half a ton more than the mainsail and having loads of thrust. So it makes sense to use them. So, well, we are very close to the asteroid. We're moving at almost the same velocity, so I'm thinking I can just slide up to it and match velocities, but no, not really. The RCS is a bit too weak. But from here it's easy to do the rendezvous. We're gonna reduce the throttle to about 49%, that's half, because we don't need more. We're not gonna have any use for more than that. So from here we just fly in slowly and grab the asteroid. This one is significantly smaller than the last one I tried, so we should be able to bring this home. We align the ship with the center of mass, and then we align the whole thing with the retrograde direction, because we're going to capture this one. And then we restore control to the cockpit and we try firing, which leads to the craft spinning, and because it's a very heavy object, the moment of inertia means that we have to spend a lot of energy getting back, and as you can see, firing one engine isn't really helping. So we're just gonna have to do it slowly and carefully, and the reason it spins is that the center of mass is not completely aligned with the center of thrust, or the axis of thrust. So we're just gonna have to readjust and try again. But before we do, we should try and get a sample from this asteroid in high Kerbin orbit, because we're going to bring it to the low Kerbin orbit, so we should get a bit of science. So after several tries, we have gotten an almost captured orbit. Well, it's quite far actually, but we have got a periapse that we wait for, and I figured out that if you unlock the hinge that is the claw, you can get a much more stable system, like this. And we're out of fuel in the radial tanks, so let's drop them, and well, I'm sure no one's really gonna care about that. So let's keep going. Note that the engines are running, it's just that the thrust is so low that the effects aren't on. See, I just bring them up a little bit more and the effects start showing. So this is a rather tedious process, getting the asteroid slowed down sufficiently to get an aerobraking maneuver. But slowly but surely we are getting there. The anchor, or the truss section, is heavily reinforced with struts, and I'm thankful I did, because there's a lot of stress on that joint. As you can see, this it's wobbling around a lot, this thing. But eventually we get it slowed down enough, under 100 meters per second, to have a low periapse, a periapse within the atmosphere. And we're gonna do the rest of the maneuver using aerobraking. I'm trying to get this into the atmosphere head on so that we have the engines pointing back, so that in case of emergency we can use the engines to lift up the apoapses. Now this turns out to be very unnecessary, as the aerobraking I set up was very shallow, and thus we have to do multiple aerobraking sessions. This is going to take quite a long time. Actually, it's going to take very many aerobrakes, so we're just going to fast forward through all of them. And somewhere in here we also have time to get another surface sample. This time it is from low curve in orbit, and eventually we get the apoapses down far enough that I'm going to just do the rest of the thing manually. For now, the only goal here is to have the asteroid in a low curve in orbit that is stable. And when I've done these two maneuvers, raising the periapse and lowering the apoapse, we have a fairly circular polar orbit. No orbit that anything else is in, but we can launch crafts however we want. And then we have completed the C-class capture. We only need to get the rest of them. And surely anything smaller, the B and A class, are going to be trivial compared to this one. Challenge is figuring out how to deal with the larger ones. Maybe this current concept can be refined and expanded. This craft still has plenty of fuel left, and yeah, it could be made reusable if you have docking ports instead of the couplers. Anyway, this is the final burn, and we're gonna bring Jeb and Bill back next episode. I thank you for watching and hope to see you then. Bye!